Hello and welcome to today's webinar to explore the findings from the nation's report card, the 2015 Mathematics and Reading in Grade 12. I'm Bill Bashaw, Executive Director of the National Assessment Governing Board and moderator of today's event. The Governing Board is a nonpartisan organization created by Congress to set policy for the National Assessment of Education Progress, NAEP, also known as the nation's report card. The results we'll discuss today detailed 12th graders' performance in math and reading nationwide. We'll also discuss findings based on the Governing Board's groundbreaking research about the percentage of 12th graders who are academically prepared for college. We have with us today a panel of experts who will share their thoughts on the findings and the implications, and we will respond to questions from our audience. So next, let me introduce our expert panel. First, Dr. Peggy Carr, Acting Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, will present the report card results. Next is Dale Nowlin, Mathematics Chair at Columbus North High School in Indiana, and a 12th grade teacher representative on the National Assessment Governing Board. We also have Margretta Brown, an English teacher at Richard Montgomery High School in Rockville, Maryland, and a member of the Nape Standing Writing Committee and the Standing Reading Committee. And finally, we have Julie Evans, CEO of Project Tomorrow, a national education nonprofit whose mission is to ensure that today's students are well prepared to become tomorrow's leaders and innovators. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for helping us today. But before we begin, Jennifer, our webinar producer, will review logistics for the webinar platform. Jennifer?
Thank you, Bill. As you mentioned, our panelists will respond to questions from the audience. To submit a question, simply type it into the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen, and then be sure to click on Send. Please include your full name and the name of your organization with your questions. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. If you experience technical difficulties, please send us a note using the chat box, or you can also email nagb@compartners.com, and we'll assist you as soon as possible. Bill?
Thank you, Jennifer. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Peggy Carr to present the results of the nation's report card, the 2015 Mathematics and Reading at Grade 12. Peggy?
Thank you, Bill. I'm here today to release results of the 2015 12th grade Mathematics and Reading assessments from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as our nation's report card. The assessments were administered from January through March of 2015, and about 32,000 12th graders participated in the two assessments. This includes over 13,000 12th graders who were assessed in mathematics and almost 19,000 who were assessed in reading. The national results are for both private and public school students in 2015. They are compared to the last assessment in 2013 and from the first assessment year, which was 1992 for reading and 2005 for mathematics. Student performance on Nape is reported in two ways: as average scale scores and as percentage of students at the various Nape achievement levels. Mathematics scores are reported on a scale of 0 to 300, while reading scores are reported on a scale of 0 to 500. Now we'll take a closer look at student results, and we're going to start with mathematics. As a reminder, when reporting scores and percentages, we only discuss differences that are statistically significant. In 2015, the average scale score of all students who took the Nape mathematics assessment was 152. This was a decrease from 2013, when the average scale scores for all students was 153. And this is indicated by the asterisk here, but is not significantly different from the average score of 150 in 2005. Scores are also reported using percentiles to show trends and results for students performing at the lower, middle, and higher levels of the distribution. At the 10th, 25th, and 50th percentiles, average scale scores in 2015 were lower than in 2013. Scores in 2015 at the 75th and 90th percentiles showed no significant change compared to 2013. Next, we'll take a look at how the percentages of students at various achievement levels have changed over time. 12th grade students performing at the proficient level should be able to recognize when particular concepts, procedures, and strategies are appropriate, and to select, integrate, and apply them to solve problems. On the far right, we see the percentage of students performing at or above proficient has not changed significantly compared to 2013 or 2005. On the left, we see the percentage of students performing below basic has increased since 2015 from 35% to 38%. Here again, we see a larger proportion of students at the bottom of the distribution than in 2013, while the top of the distribution has remained relatively unchanged. Since 2013, the last assessment year, scores for all racial ethnic groups showed no significant changes, as indicated here by the diamonds. For both male and female students, scores decreased compared to 2013, as indicated by the downward arrows. In the upmost columns, we see the demographic compositions of the Nape sample has not changed significantly from 2013. Compared to 2005, scores increased for all racial ethnic groups except American Indian, Alaska Native, while the overall average remained flat. Looking at the far right columns, you see that the proportions of students who are white, Hispanic, or two or more races have significantly changed. Neither male nor female students show significant increases in performance compared to 2005. To continue our examination of the results, we now turn our attention to some additional student groups. At the top of the slide, we see students' reported parental education status. As a reminder, the 12th grade sample, we asked students to report parental education as our SES variable, while in the 4th and 8th grades, we use eligibility for the National School Lunch Program. In 2015, scores for students who had a parent whose highest level of education did not finish high school, decreased by 4 points compared to 2013. Students who had parents whose highest level of education was some education after high school decreased by 3 points. Since 2013, scores for students without disabilities decreased by 2 points compared to 2005. Compared to 2013, scores for English language learners increased by 6 points. They were the only student group reported here that had a significant increase compared to 2013. Scores for students who are not English language learners decreased by 2 points in the same period. The Grade 12 Mathematics Framework contains 4 content areas: number properties and operations, measurement and geometry, data analysis, statistics and probability, and algebra. In 2015, scores decreased in all 4 of these mathematics content areas or subscales by 2 points compared to 2013. Now we'll look at the results for reading. Looking at the average reading scores over time, grade 12 students had an average score of 287 in 2015, which was not significantly different from their score in 2013, but it was lower than in 1992. By percentile, we see the lower performing students at the 10th and 25th percentiles scored lower in 2015 compared to both 2013 and 1992. The scores for students at the 90th percentile was higher in 2015 compared to 2013 and 1992. The scores for students at the 50th percentile in 2015 were not significantly different compared to 2013, but it was lower than in 1992. We often talk about gaps relative to student subgroups like gender or race ethnicity. Here we see a different kind of gap where student performance at the top of the distribution is increasing and performance for those at the lower end is decreasing. This is a widening of the performance distribution across all students. This slide shows percentage changes across the Nape achievement levels. 12th grade students performing at the proficient level should be able to locate and integrate information using sophisticated analysis of the text. 37% of students scored at or above proficient in 2015, which was not significantly different from 2013. 6% scored at the advanced level, an increase compared to 2013. 31% scored at the proficient level, which was not significantly different from 2013, while 35% scored at the basic level, which was a decrease. The percentage of students below basic, 28%, increased compared to 2013. As I mentioned before, you can see a widening gap with more students at the top and the bottom of the performance distribution than in 2013 or 1992. Compared to 1992, the percentage of students at or above proficient was lower in 2015, while the percentage of advanced level increased. Percentages at the proficient and basic level decreased, while the percentage showing below basic increased compared to 1992. Looking at score changes for various student groups in 2015 compared to 2013, we see no significant differences in the average scale scores. Comparing the demographic composition of Nape sample in the up rightmost columns, we see that the percentage of students in these groups did not change significantly compared to 2013, except for an increase in the percentage of students who are two or more races using unrounded numbers. Let's take a look at score changes for various student groups in 2015 compared to 1992. There were decreases for black students, male students, and female students. The rightmost columns show the demographic makeup of the 1992 sample. There was a decrease in the percentage of white students, while there were increases in percentage of students who are Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islanders, American Indian, Alaskan Natives, and two or more races over the same period. This slide looks at score changes for additional student groups. Scores for students across the range of parental education levels were not significantly different in 2015 compared to 2013, but were lower compared to 1992. We do not see any significant differences in 2015 compared to 2013 based on disability status or status as English language learner. Now I will summarize. In 2015, the national average score in mathematics was lower. In reading, the average score was about the same in comparison to 2013. But we did see that the performance distribution was wider in 2015 compared to 2013 and to 1992. In both subjects, comparing the 2015 results to 2013, the scores of students performing at the 10th and 25th percentiles were lower. The percentage of 12th grade students performing at or above proficient was not significantly different, and the percentage of students scoring below basic was higher. In 2015, in mathematics, male students scored higher on average than their female students. Looking at this gender gap by race ethnicity, we see that white and Hispanic males scored higher than their female counterparts. In comparison, the average score for female students in reading was higher overall than for male students. Female students who are white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and 2 or more races scored higher than their male counterparts. Since 2008, the National Assessment Governing Board has been conducting research on the use of grade 12 NAEP results as an indicator of students' academic preparedness for college. These studies indicate that students scoring at or above 163 on the Nape mathematics scale, 0 to 300, are likely to possess the knowledge, skills, and abilities that would make them academically prepared for college. For reading, students scoring at or above 302 on the Nape reading scale, which again was 0 to 500, are likely to possess these skills. These last slides I will present are data for 2015. In 2015 mathematics, 37% of 12th grade students scored at or above 163 on the Nape scale of 0 to 300. Again, this indicates academic preparedness for college. 39% scored at or above 163 in 2013. In 2015, in reading, 37% of 12th grade students scored at or above 302 on the Nape scale of 0 to 500, which again indicates academic preparedness for college. 38% scored at or above 302 in 2013. In conclusion, you can view the report card in its entirety online, and you can explore more data than I've presented here today. As always, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the students, teachers, and schools who participated in the 2015 Nape 12th grade reading and mathematics assessment. Thank you. Bill?
Hey, thanks, Peggy. Excellent comprehensive report. We really appreciate it. So our audience has submitted some questions about the report card, and there's one here that I'd love to have your insight on, Peggy. It's from Tricia Crane with the Alabama School Connection, and Tricia asks, please explain how the sample size is relevant and how sampling is a valid statistical tool.
Yes, thank you. As with most of the surveys that we collect at the National Center for Education Statistics, this is a sample survey, a comprehensive probability sample, which represents accurately the sample that it wishes to make inferences about. Sample size is very important in our ability to have confidence in these samples and making references to the larger population. So the larger the sample, the greater our confidence, the greater our reliability, and the smaller the confidence interval around our estimate of what the true score would be. Whether we're talking about a score or you're talking about a percentage of students from the sample, the estimation would be the same. It would rely on the sample size. There are other factors that are important, such as how homogeneous the sample is. You want the sample to be as heterogeneous as possible and to reflect the true nature of the population for which you're going to make an inference. But clearly most important here for most of our samples at the center, we want a sample size that is large enough to give us reliability and validity and confidence in our estimates. Hopefully that helps, Bill.
Perfect. Thanks, Peggy. Appreciate it. We'd like to turn the conversation over to other members of our expert panel. First, let's hear the thoughts on the results from Dale Nowlin. Dale?
Thanks, Bill. Well, first of all, it's, of course, disappointing that math scores are down. It's also disappointing that they're down in all 4 areas of mathematics that students are tested over, and specifically that the scores are significantly down for the, when you look at percentiles, the lower performing students, which is actually widening the gap between high performing students and low performing students. I feel like I need to give a plug here. I know we're always bound by budgets, but it would be really wonderful if we had state data to go with this, because I think too often when we see national results, it's easy for us in different states to think surely that's because of the other states and not because of us. But I think that it's important that we reflect on what does this mean in terms of our own policies in our own states and in our practices in school districts and in schools. I want to we don't really know what caused the decline, and maybe it's a one-year anomaly, but I do want to conjecture at some possible causes and what that might mean for us in schools and in school districts. One thing is that over the years, graduation rates have increased. I know they've increased for us locally, and that's true across the nation. And any part of the lower scores that are due to increased graduation rates are actually a good thing. I'm sure that does not account for the entire drop in scores, though. The second area of concern, I guess, for me is to think about curriculum. There's been a lot of talk about curriculum across the nation lately. A lot of that talk has been around Common Core. So one of the concerns under curriculum is how well does it align to what we test on NAEP? And I know that NCES looked into that to some extent, and what they found is that it's not a perfect alignment, and that might be a cause for part of the decline, but it certainly does not account for the whole drop in scores. But there are a couple other issues that I think we should be concerned about in terms of curriculum. One is the fact that anytime you change curriculum, it takes some time for teachers and students to adjust to the change in what's taught and how it's being taught, and that might be something that researchers could look at and measure. A lot of states have been changing curriculum, either going to Common Core or changing their own state standards. In our state, in Indiana, we were one of the first states to pull out of Common Core, and what that has meant in terms of curriculum, we're on a 6-year textbook adoption cycle, and over this last 6 years of our current cycle, we have actually changed state standards 3 times. And anytime we're making that frequent and as many changes in state standards as that, teachers are really trying to aim at a moving target, which is a challenge in many respects. And I know we're not the only state that has changed standards multiple times over the past few years. And finally, in terms of curriculum, And these are all areas that I think would be great for researchers to dig into the data and see what they can see. But as states have changed curriculum, I think there's probably a wide variation on how much professional development has gone along with that. In the most recent Nape release, Nape and TUDA, of the 4th grade and 8th grade results, we saw specifically some urban districts. I'm thinking of Miami-Dade and Chicago and Washington, D.C., that they had targeted professional development with their teachers, and those districts saw significant gains. So as many states and districts are changing curriculum to match new standards, I think it's really important for us to look at the importance of professional development to go along with those changes. Then the third thing to consider, I know there weren't drastic changes in demographics from 2013, but I never want to lose sight of the fact that our demographics are changing. At my district, the Hispanic population over the past few years has increased dramatically, and I know that that we're not alone in that. And other minorities, too, have increased significantly, and we're a suburban school in the Midwest. And our free and reduced lunch population has changed dramatically over the past few years, too. And those populations have specific needs that we may need to make sure that we're meeting. That does bring us to one of the few positives that came out of the data. The English language learners, or ELL students, had a significant increase from 2013 to 2015, with increasing numbers of students that are English language learners. In my school, and I know this is true across the nation, that there has been a lot of attention, a lot of resources, a lot of effort put towards how can we help those students. Really, it's a couple things specifically that we have done. Those students have a resource where they can go and get content help while they're learning English. And also the fact that we have gone to digital textbooks, our students can access their textbook not just in English, but if they're more comfortable in Spanish, they can access the Spanish digital textbook. And I think the effort that people are putting into the needs of the English language learners, hopefully it's paying off. The final thing I want to highlight is something we have seen before, and that's that what math courses students take make a difference in how they do on Nape. Students that are enrolled in calculus and pre-calculus score better than students who never take those courses. The easy answer to that is let's put all of our students in calculus and pre-calculus, but obviously that's not what we want to do. What we need to do is look at students when they're in 8th grade and 9th grade and 10th grade and look at what can we do to take down the barriers for those kids reaching the higher level math courses, and what things can we put in place to help them with that. Anything we can do to move students into higher math courses in a successful way is going to be a win for the schools and a win for the students. So that's what I have to share.
Well, thank you, Dale. A thoughtful presentation on the math results in particular. Again, I have a question from our audience that I'd like to pose to you, if you don't mind. This is from Teresa Del Riso from North Providence Public Schools in Rhode Island. And Teresa asks, how do we address math and literacy also? How do we address the gaps at the high school level?
I think that's one of the toughest challenges for classroom teachers. I have myself taught, we call it an algebra block class, and it's really for students who are taking, all of our students are required to take algebra by 9th grade. Not all of our students are ready for algebra in 9th grade. And so you run into many gaps. A good example would be students who are learning algebra but they haven't mastered fractions. What would be the worst thing to do is to not teach them algebra and just go back and try to focus just on the gaps. And when you do that, then those students, that's what we did in the past, and we had students who never got to algebra. So I think the challenge is to go back and try to fill in the gaps in the context of the new material. and do the best you can at filling the gaps in while you're moving the students forward, which is a huge challenge.
Right, and it sounds like it's something that's not just the responsibility at the high school level, but also middle and elementary level.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Hey, our next speaker is Margretta Brown. Margretta, we'll turn to you.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon. I'd like to start off addressing that from 2013 to 2015, there has been no significant changes in scores on the Nape reading test, but there is still a gap between white and black students at 30 points and white and Hispanic students at 20 points. This data is particularly significant at my own school, which has a very diverse makeup and shows similar results when we're measuring performance in the classroom by GPA among groups. So our literacy goal is to decrease the gap between the percentage of African American, Hispanic, and white and Asian students earning a C or higher in English, and we try to start at grade 9. So the Nape data shows the benefits of academic discourse, which has become an important literary goal at our high school where I teach. Students talking about text and their interpretation of it does make a difference academically. We want students to be able to move through various ways of thinking about the text, from a simple locate and recall to integrate and interpret, and then finally critique and evaluate. So we try to make students cognitive of how they talk about and how they work with the text. So, for example, in my own classroom, the previous night's homework may have included a range of questions from all three areas, locate and recall through to critique and evaluate. And so they may come into class the next day and they're given a chance to pair share their findings, talk with their neighbors, and just sort of get them warmed up and thinking before we engage in a larger class conversation. And I try to include different methods of random calling to make sure that each student does actually get an opportunity to talk about their reading the night before. So one day it might be boy, girl, boy, girl. The next day I might have a bowl with names in it and pull the students' names out randomly. Or a classroom might look like they come in, they immediately move into small groups, and then those groups are given an opportunity to talk about the reading from the night before and their questions, and then the groups report out or perhaps even annotate a small part of the text and think more deeply about it. But all of these different ways of addressing academic discourse gives them a way to talk about text, and eventually the expectation is that they will be able to work with those questions that require higher levels of critical thinking. And it's also useful to me as an instructor because it gives me another way to really assess where students' strengths and weaknesses are, which is very important in the classroom. So this investment that they take in their own thinking promotes engagement of the text, and we want them to read. And sometimes just doing that can be a challenge, just getting them interested in reading. The Nape data shows that the more we get them to read in school and for homework, the higher their scores are. So it's very important that we use engaging yet challenging text from both literary and informational genres, that these texts should be diverse and reflect the global world that we live in. So an example of something I might use in my own classroom might be a classic text like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or a more modern text like Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carry, maybe something mid-century like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and perhaps even a graphic novel such as Marjane Satrapi's Percentiles. I often like to work in my informational pieces with the anchor text. For example, while reading The Things They Carry, I may have students read an article from the newspaper that discusses PTSD and the effects on soldiers today. So if students are invested, they are going to be curious and they are going to read more. And as seen on the Nape reading test, students who read more in school and for homework do tend to have the higher scores. So really it's up to us as the instructor to make the class as impactful as possible for our students. Educators, I think, can really use the Nape data to make the most of their time in class. We want them to think more deeply about text, which requires that exposure to rich and engaging text. We want them to reach the point of critique and evaluate, which requires, that practice in class with the text. And then, finally we want them to know how to think critically about any text they might encounter. And Nape's test has been able to validate a lot of what we as teachers see in the classrooms every day. And that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Margretta.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent, practical, pragmatic suggestions. Again, we have a question from the audience. You may have actually answered this partially, but let me present it to you. It's from Cindy Bengi. She's from the Aldine Independent School District in Texas. And Cindy asks, what specific trends in reading do you see with 12th grade that can be addressed with changes in instruction in high school language arts?
Yes. Well, actually, I can touch on something that I did not in the first part of my presentation, and that is that, we do have fast-moving developments in technology, and so I do think that it is important for districts to invest in good professional development. We need to be up to speed so that we can best integrate the latest in technology in our classroom. So these advances in technology, they really are changing the landscape of reading and how we process information. So Dale mentioned it in his presentation, and I think that investing in the teachers is investing in and making sure that the students are getting the instruction they need to be ready for college and for work.
Well, again, thank you. And we have a very large audience out listening in today. I think it's safe to assume that several members of our audience like to tweet, and so we just want to remind you, if you're so inclined, it's hashtag NAEP. And now our final panelist is Julie Evans. Julie, would you share your perspective?
Thanks so much, Bill. I am thrilled to have this opportunity to answer and reflect on the results and give maybe a slightly different perspective here. We can advance the slide. Thank you. I'm very excited about the particular aspect of using Nape as an indicator for academic preparedness. So what I'd like to do is bring into the discussion some research findings that my organization, Project Tomorrow, has about students' attitudes about their learning experiences and about their academic preparation. So as we heard from Peggy just a few moments ago, a little bit more than a third of students are, based on this new research, prepared for college, academically prepared for college. But we also know from a practical standpoint that preparation is just not about knowledge itself. It's also about the application of that knowledge. And so it's interesting to take a look at students' perceptions of learning, the value they place on learning, what their goals are, what they're thinking about for their future, as playing a part in developing that academic preparation. So we asked 107,000 high school students this past fall to talk to us in a survey that Project Tomorrow conducts about their thoughts about school and about learning and about the experience that they were having as part of their academic preparation. And so it's concerning to us when we look at these particular statistics that less than 50% of our high school students value what they are learning in school as having a connection to their future. And that included both subjects that they're learning as well as skills. So that should be a wake-up moment for us as well in relationship to these scores today. But there actually is another piece of this puzzle. And I think this is the more positive part of the story. So Contrastingly to the way the students are valuing what they're learning in school, 82% of high school students told us that doing well in school is important to them. I think that's a really strong statement, not only about the students' attitudes about learning, but the fact that they do want to be proficient, they do want to be prepared, they do want to do a good job, and they like learning. So we can see here that over two-thirds of students said that learning how to do things and learning about new ideas was something that was important for them. We can move on to the next slide. This disconnect between what students are learning and the value they place on that and their greater views around learning gets even messier when we start looking at what students are doing outside of school to prepare themselves for the future. I think we could probably all agree that school no longer has that exclusivity on being the place of learning. And in fact, for many students, it is not their primary source of learning, particularly as it pertains to their future. So here we had from that 107,000 high school students, 50% of them saying that they're learning important things for their future on their own outside of school. And that may be a wake-up moment for many educators and school leaders. So why are students believing or doing these type of things outside of school? And I think this is where we get to some really strong connections here into our NAEP scores and also in thinking about the schools of the future. So the students told us on this survey that the primary reason that they are using digital tools outside of school to self-direct their learning is for self-remediation, and it's particularly in math. So the students have a very cognizant understanding that they are deficient or have deficiencies in their mathematical understanding, and so they are tapping into some online and digital tools that might even just be through a smartphone or some type of mobile device to get that remediation. So that might mean watching online videos from something like the Khan Academy to self-remediate, or to be able to participate in an online class in addition to their brick-and-mortar class, not as a replacement for that class, to once again self-direct that learning to get themselves up to speed. In addition to that, we see that the students are using a wide range of different digital tools to also help with skill development. It was particularly noteworthy to us in our research findings that students were using online writing tools outside of school, not homework assigned, not an assignment or a project, but on their own to develop their writing skills. In many cases, the students told us that the use of those tools gave them an audience, and they particularly appreciated getting peer review on their writing as a means to help develop better writing skills. And I think we all know that more writing that students can do improves those writing skills. Students are also tapping into online games and even social media to get ideas and to think about what other people are doing and to make some critical assessments of that environment that they're living in. So the development of critical thinking skills is equally important. Go ahead to the next slide. So I think we're at a really interesting point here where these new realities around the use of technology and, more importantly, students' perceptions of the value of their school-based learning present sort of a challenge and an opportunity. Now, we know that many factors influence how prepared students are for college, for career, for the military, for vocational training. I think it's particularly promising that students have a high interest in their academic success, but that this disconnect between the way that students are valuing what's happening during their school day and the types of learning experiences that they're having in their school day and what they themselves perceive as their needs for greater preparation to be able to compete and contribute in the global society is a concerning point of this. Now, all of that has resulted in this emergence or this increasing of this new phenomenon where students are self-directing learning around academic interests using these digital tools that are available to them. But again, that is beyond school sponsorship. So we have really an interesting golden opportunity here to rethink the way we are both approaching education during the school hours and also to think about this concept around academic preparation. So if we take into account what students are doing on their own outside of school to prepare themselves for the future, it really could be a very interesting conversation to start thinking about increasing the relevancy of their formalized education process, but also from a new research standpoint to think about what students are doing outside of school, self-directing their own learning, and what that means in terms of a reflection on the value that they place in terms of their school-based academics. So to this big conversation about academic preparedness, I applaud the new research that has been done to be able to give us some strong foundational elements around students' academic preparation, but also call for a greater interest or a greater exposure to what students are doing outside of school as a way to maybe understand some of these statistics.
Julie, thank you so much. Under your leadership, Project Tomorrow has done such a great job collecting the student voice, really collecting and broadcasting the student voice around schooling, and this is so helpful what you shared with us. I have another question that I'd like to direct toward you. It's from Lucinda Muzek of Everybody Wins in D.C., Washington, D.C., and here's the question. Would having students assessed upon entering high school be of value to determine how they could be better prepared for college?
That's a great question, Bill, and a really thoughtful one, so congratulations to Lucinda for asking that. I think my bottom line answer from our perspective is yes. I think that the more that we know about either students' current academic preparation for college, career, military preparedness, or their valuation of how they're thinking about academic preparedness would be so helpful to be able to understand what we need to do to make sure that these students are on the right path. We know that preparing for college doesn't start in 12th grade. In fact, it doesn't even start in 9th grade. But to be able to have some more landmark data and to understand where students are on that pathway, what their attitudes and valuations are around academic preparedness, and what they need to be able to feel that they are on the right path would be so valuable, not only for the nation at large, but also for teachers themselves and the schools that they are part of. You know, there's a huge conversation out there about the value of personalizing learning and addressing student needs. And being able to understand what students are thinking about in terms of academic preparedness and to be able to have data such as this to take a look at that, I think would be incredibly valuable.
Wow, wonderful. So we've had a great program to this point. Peggy did a terrific job providing this year's results on the nation's report card. Dale and Margretta shared from the classroom perspective both some very practical and pragmatic ideas along with some important policy issues, and then Julie summed it all up with information from the student point of view, which is so critical and so important. So thank you all for your insights. Now let's take some additional questions, and my co-facilitator on this segment is Greg Orson, and he'll direct audience questions to one of our speakers, but we also encourage other speakers to comment if they're so inclined. So Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Again, to submit a question for the panelists, type it into the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen and click send. We also have questions that were submitted by attendees before the event, and we will try to answer as many questions as time allows. Our first question is from Beth LaDuca with the Oregon Department of Education. She asks, is the information from Nape regarding academic preparedness for college consistent with data from other sources such as Smarter Balanced or PARC? I know that Dale mentioned alignment with the assessment consortia a bit in his remarks, but Peggy, I wonder if you could, based on your awareness, if you could speak to NAEP scores as they may relate to the consortia tests?
Well, it's a good question, but unfortunately it's a complicated one. The answer is fairly complicated because PARC doesn't have all of the states. It has a small proportion of the states. That would be true for SBAC, Smarter Balance as well. But we did take a look at the results for those those entities. And what we see on average, for example, in math, PARC is showing the small number of states included, about 21% of their students are prepared if you consider their highest levels, which I think might be comparable to what they would purport. And in reading, about 40% at their highest levels, 4 and 5, for the, again, small number of states that they included. Smarter balance is even more difficult, so I won't even try to venture into that comparison. So I think it's a bit of apples and oranges without more representation and knowledge of how the states that are included in their samples really reflect the nation. But I can say that for the ACT, which is something that we've been thinking about as a comparable comparison, and for the SAT, we see numbers that are slightly higher. For ACT, for example, in 2014, for their readiness in math, it was about 42. 46 would be the comparable number for reading for the ACT. And for the SAT, and they combined theirs, is about 41%, or maybe closer to 42 if you round it up. So I think the caution here would be that students select, for the most part, into the SAT and SAT, so it's a slightly different sample than what would be the case for the Nape study, which, you know, is a representative sample of all students that have taken this assessment. So if we take these two factors into account, we can make the comparison with some caution. Hopefully that's helpful.
Terrific. Thank you, Peggy. Several of our participants, including Ellis Ott with the Fairbanks North School District and Susan Fitzpatrick with the James S. McDonald Foundation, have asked about what the data can tell us about preparedness for careers. Bill, I know the governing board has done some research about preparedness for job training. I wonder if you could start us off in a response there?
Sure. So initially we were researching and exploring the relationship between the Nape scores and academic preparedness, first for the transition to college, and then also the transition to careers, and finally the transition to opportunities in the military. We were able, through the research, to establish, through linkage studies, a pretty solid relationship to that transition from high school to college. Unfortunately, because of the many different career opportunities, we just were never able to establish that. We desperately wanted to know and to be able to answer that question, but we couldn't do it reliably in a way that we were going to share that with the public. So we backed away from that. And I guess the same thing with the military being similar.
Thanks. Julie, I know you have an interest in this topic as well. Would you care to add anything about preparedness for careers?
Well, I think it is a really interesting conversation, and it's obviously one that employers are very interested in. You know, are our students being well prepared not just for college success, but to be able to come in to a job and to be able to function? So when we look at what employers are saying are the types of skills that they are most interested in, I'm always drawn to employers' conversations around the needs for employees to be good critical thinkers and problem solvers. And so whereas I agree with Bill, it's hard to make some of these leapfrog jumps, it is, of course, interesting to look at and say, if we are doing critical reading, if we are having strong math aptitude, those should be the types of things that could prepare students to develop their muscles for critical thinking and problem solving, and to be able to develop that sort of competency. And of course, that is obviously what some of the goals are around some of the new standards around career and college preparation. So I think it's interesting to keep it in perspective and maybe not be able to draw the direct links from A to B to C, but to understand that the ultimate goal of what we are trying to do is obviously to prepare these students to be fully functional and economically self-sufficient. And the fact that the employers are calling for these type of skills means that we do need to be paying attention to this.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a question from Jessica Williams with Microsoft, and others have posed similar questions. She'd like us to address the trend over time as it relates to contributing factors such as testing approach and methodology or standard curricula that may have changed over time. I know that several participants have also expressed an interest in how Common Core may have played a role in the results. Dale, I know you addressed that partly in your remarks, but I wonder if our other panelists would like to weigh in on that question. Margretta or Julie, for example. How contributing factors such as testing approach or standard curricula may have lent themselves to the Nape results, and maybe your perspectives in the classroom or what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis.
This is Julie. I can give a little bit of a perspective there, and I'd love to hear from others. I think that our situation in our schools today, and again, we sort of float above a 50,000-foot level in terms of the research that we do, is very much in flux. Dale mentioned the changing curriculum standards, but in addition to that, there are changing expectations for students. There are changing roles of teachers. The instruction model is changing in many schools. And so I do think that may, when I read through the results, that was what struck me, that when we're looking at the flux or the changes or the dynamicism in our school environment today, we would probably be short-sighted if we did not realize that would have to be a contributing factor to some of these results.
This is Dale, and I'd like to weigh in on that in a slightly different perspective, I think, if that's okay. One of the things that we have been working a lot on the governing board is our transition to digitally based testing, and this obviously doesn't impact the results we're looking at right now, but I think more and more students are taking high-stakes tests online or on computers, and as Nape heads in that direction, I actually see Nape as a leader in that, because some of the things we're looking at in terms of the digitally based testing that's coming down very soon will give us much richer results, and I think that they will engage the students a lot more in the testing. So in terms of the technology, it's going to have a huge impact in the next few rounds of testing, and I know Peggy and her people are working real hard to connect it in terms of trends so we don't lose trend when we make that transition.
Hi, this is Margretta, and I'm just commenting on the changes that I've seen in my own school for teachers. The implementation of the PARC and Common Core has meant not only changing to meet the new curriculum standards, but also a lot of extra responsibilities for the teacher, which include doing all kinds of reports and keeping track of student data, which isn't a bad thing, keeping track of student data in the classroom. But we do seem to, because of requirements, spend a lot of time tending to needs outside of preparation for our classes, which could cause a problem. And we also spend a lot of time doing a lot of repetitive meeting about making sure that we're meeting all the new requirements. So just sort of, getting ourselves situated to handle all the new standards that come along with the Common Core and the kids being successful on the PARC in the beginning can disrupt some of what goes on in the classroom.
This is Peggy.
Go ahead, Peggy.
Yeah, I wanted to add to some of the good thinking that I've heard thus far. I want to particularly comment on the number of factors that I've heard at the beginning of our dialogue around dropout rates and graduation rates and course taking, because I think those are some really important factors to consider in the trends that we're seeing today. And I can add to it some actual numbers that might put it into stronger context. The dropout rate, for example, has improved from 12% to 7% from 1990 to 2012. That's a really good picture. The graduation rate has improved from 74% in 1990 to 82% in 2012. Now, we've seen similar growth patterns or improvement patterns for all the racial ethnic groups, although they're not always this good. But it does mean that we have more students in school, students that normally would not be there. And what we know from the data today is that students are more likely to be taking a course in their 12th grade year, a math course in their 12th grade year than they did years before. And that's a good thing because they score higher in all of these assessments that we've been tracking for 12th graders if, in fact, they take a course, regardless of what the course is, in the 12th grade. The other point that I think Norland mentioned earlier that I think bears repeating is that there has been a change in the pattern of course taking over the last few years. Since 2005, for example, there's been an uptick in students taking calculus, and a similar pattern for students taking pre-calculus as their last course taken. And conversely, which is what you would expect to see, less students are reporting that their last course as they end their 12th grade year is an algebra 1 or geometry. And I just looked at these results by race, and it's pretty consistent. So we have students that we normally would not have in these comparisons. The population is shifting for the better, and they are also taking more advanced courses.
Greg, this is Bill, and if you don't mind, if I can add into this, I know I'm technically the moderator, but I think this is a great question from Jessica, and there's people out there who really study change in environments. Michael Fullen comes to mind as one who's an expert on this. There's no question that educators across America have decided we want to do everything we can to improve student skills and knowledge in a variety of areas. And this has resulted in multifaceted change that's affecting classrooms and schools across America. And while we would like to see those changes result in immediate and impactful positive results, the experts that study change often have documented that sometimes there's a slight dip in so the performance that we measure before we actually see the increases that we're hoping for. I don't know if that's happening here. I do applaud the educators across America who are doing everything they can to strengthen the skills that our high school students have as they exit high school, though.
Great. Thanks so much to all of our panelists. Really interesting. Zeev Werman with IEEE and several others have asked about state results, why those are not available, and how many states may have participated in the assessment. Bill, are you able, I know that Peggy touched on the sampling, are you able to speak a bit more to the role of states in this grade 12 assessment?
Yes, very much so, and Peggy can also chime in here. The governing board has said, and has a set of priorities, and included in one of those priorities is to have state-level data in as many different assessments as we possibly can. And again, Peggy can speak to this. In this case, it's a resource issue. To do the larger sample for the state-level data simply costs more, and we just weren't in a position to do it. That's not to say that it isn't a priority for the governing board and for NCES, not only here in the 12th grade, but also in some of our other assessments that we do to have that state-level data.
Bill, I think you're exactly right. I can't add much to that. I think that answer is the most appropriate one. I would add that it is a pilot project. It is a pilot program in the sense that it's not required for states to participate in 12th grade as it is for 4 and 8 for the reading and math assessment. And in 2013, I think we had 13 states to volunteer to participate. In the time before that, we had 11. And so it is something that states want to do, and all states don't want to do it. I think there is a growing desire to be part of our 12th grade assessment. But keep in mind, it is a pilot project. We do it when we have funds to do it. And when we do implement the program, states volunteer to participate.
Thanks, Peggy. One other thing, Greg, that it hasn't come up as a question here today, but it's the issue of, do 12th graders really engage in this assessment? Do they take it seriously? And Peggy, you have some pretty good data on that question about 12th grade engagement.
Yes, Bill, that's a really good point. It's a question we get all the time when we release these 12th grade data. And so we've been tracking some indicators that give us some level of comfort that students are engaged with the assessment. You know, motivation is a difficult construct to measure, but we do have some indicators that tell us a little bit about how students are interacting with the assessment when we look at omit rates, meaning they just skip over questions, or they don't, or they stop and don't reach the end of the block. We've been looking at these indicators over time, and quite honestly, they've been holding steady. The response rates to our questions are in the high 90s. It hasn't changed measurably over a 10-year period. And so we believe that students, whatever results we're looking at today, are not differentially influenced in any way by students' engagement with the items themselves.
Great. Thanks so much for bringing that up, Bill. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Susan Fitzpatrick, again with the McDonald Foundation, has a pretty interesting question, I think best addressed to Julie. She asks, is there a risk that self-directed learning will widen educational gaps? Julie, do you have thoughts about that?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, we do a lot of research around students' access to technology as an opportunity to do that sort of self-directed learning. And so I would say, Susan, yes, there is definitely a risk that self-directed learning could widen educational gaps. And so when we look at the types of ways that students are self-directing learning, we do see some differentiation. But to be quite honest with you, the differentiation is often about students' familiarity with technology, more so, and their comfort with using technology for that sort of self-directed learning more than their access. So we pay a lot of attention to the equity conversation as part of this, and to make sure that when we're talking about students self-directing learning, particularly using digital tools, that is an equitable type access so that all students have the opportunity to do that. But of course, without that sort of even playing field, it does run a risk that certain students would have that sort of access more than others.
Thanks so much. And I think we'll try to sneak in one last question. Barbara Hollingsworth with CNS News asks, how do the latest NAEP scores compare to international scores in reading and mathematics? Peggy, are you able to speak to, are we able to make those international comparisons with some of the grade 12 results?
Well, I'm glad that you refined your question and asked whether we're able to make those comparisons, because I think it is a little difficult because the time periods for which we have data are not aligned very well. The TIMS results, for example, were last collected in 2011. In comparison to 2007, we've seen an improvement for grade 4 math, and for grade 8 math, we've seen no improvement, so it's holding steady. And I guess my point is that we would rather make comparisons to a comparable year, which does happen quite often with TIMS because of how it's aligned. I would say to our readers, callers, our listeners today, that the TIMS Advanced for 12th grade We haven't done 12th grade or Population 3 in a while. Will be released this year in November. Actually, I have the date, November 29th. We have a TIMS Advance for physics and a TIMS Advance for calculus. So I think we should wait with bated breath to see what goes on there. PISA, which is the other one that people like to know about our results for our 15-year-olds, that will be released this year as well, December 6th. So you can write that on your calendars here. We'll have results. The results in the past for PISA, the most recent ones from 09 to 12, have been flat for reading, math, and science. And so I think we're looking forward to what these results will say for our 15-year-olds in December.
Got it. Thank you so much. And that's actually all the time we have for questions today. So really appreciate all of our participants who did submit a question. Now I'll turn it back over to Bill for concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Greg. Hey, I hope today's discussion about the 12th grade achievement in college preparedness inspires you to learn more and to continue the conversation. Remember to join others on Twitter and talk about the findings. So it's hashtag NAEP. Also, you can visit the nationsreportcard.gov to see the full report and to examine the data in far greater detail. Additional materials include a news release and information from the Governing Board's preparedness research, and that's available right now at our website, nagb.org. And an archived version of today's webinar will be available early next month. Members of the media may contact Governing Board's Public Affairs Specialist, Stefan Harris, with questions. And in closing, I want to thank Peggy and Dale and Margretta and Julie for providing their valuable insights. I also want to thank Jennifer and Greg for helping bring this program to you. And I know, Peggy, you and I are going to join in thanking our staffs. We couldn't do anything that we're doing without their dedication and their support, the staff at NCES and the staff at the National Assessment Governing Board. And finally, of course, we thank all of you for joining us for today's discussion. Have a great rest of the day.